I would like to play around with different ways of mapping the economy. And I've been playing around in my head with something I'm calling attunement, which is sort of like, how does the economy attune its problem-solving efforts and its just efforts in general toward different people or towards different problems? Like, what problems is the economy well attuned to? And what problems is the economy really poorly attuned to? And then how do we realign that? Part of the reason I'm thinking of things this way is because when I look at the entrepreneurship economy, a lot of it has to do with attunement to your customers' needs, like attunement to their experience. Where if you are an entrepreneur, you really need to get inside the head and the frustrations and the problems of your customers. And that is something that I think has to be somewhat intuited. Like, it's not something where you can sort of figure out, these are the 5 things my customer cares about. I think oftentimes the attunement is at a deeper level than that. It's sometimes these small things about their customers' needs and what satisfies them and what makes them feel whole and wholesome that I think sometimes even the entrepreneur themselves does not realize what those things are, even while they're attuning to those needs. And when I'm thinking about the growing complexity of the economy, I'm thinking about all of the interconnected parts where you might have the government that's supposed to be attuned to the needs of a vulnerable population, or you might have, not-for-profits who are supposed to be attuning to a certain problem they care about in the population or in the economy. And same with corporations. Corporations get bigger and bigger and bigger while supposedly attuning to the needs of the customers. But then there's this growing share of the economy that's sort of these intermediary organizations. And maybe they're a government contractor where their main client is actually a bunch of government bureaucrats. And those government bureaucrats are theoretically supposed to be attuning their arrangement of everything in service of some population or some societal need. But the corporation may have as their main people to attune to the bureaucrats themselves. And I think the same is true in the corporate world, where you have a lot of businesses whose main customer is like corporate headquarters. And in theory, corporate headquarters is supposed to be aligning and attuning their services to the customer that they serve as the corporation. But I think there's a bit of leakage of this attunement as you move through a really complex long chain of people who are attuned to different people inside these large organizations. And to some degree, if we're going to fix some of the problems in the world, I think we're going to need to better align this attunement. So I want to go through these 3 quick examples and then give you a sense for where I'm going in this series, because this is going to become a series where we look at how the economy expands around certain really legitimate, important needs in the economy and sucks a lot of the attention resources and the efforts of the economy into the system rather than into serving the people that this system is supposed to be serving. So I started out with an example that at first I thought was the classic example of all of the efforts being pointed toward the customer. And that's the hairdresser. And this is because the hairdresser's attunement is primarily focused on their customer. What makes their customer happy? How do you understand each particular customer's needs and quirks? And I think hairdressers are pretty good at that. Like, they know how to figure out, what does this person want with their hair? Like, how will they be satisfied when they walk into the room tomorrow and everybody notices their new haircut? So they're good at that. And they're also good at the social element. Like, this is a social interaction that has a lot of meaning for a lot of people. And they know how to sort of figure out, what does this person need socially? And how do I make the experience of getting a haircut really good for them? So I think with hairdressers, the attunement is highly attuned to the customer that is the person getting the haircut. Then I started thinking about a mid-sized business, like a hardware store, where you have the customer with their needs. And in this case, the customer's needs have to do with their homes and the things they're fixing inside their homes. And the customer may not know exactly what they need to fix it, but the customer can kind of explain the problem. And the people who own the hardware store and who work there, part of their job is really understanding what is the problem they're talking about and being like, oh yeah, I have the solution for you. I can explain basically how you'll use it. I can make you feel comfortable about buying this to go solve your problem. I know that if it doesn't solve the problem, then I'm not going to get this returned customer. So there's something very healthy about this sort of bottom level, small business sort of hardware store situation. And with all of these, as we sort of make them bigger, there's going to be some really good elements of the attunement and some really troubling elements, especially when we start to figure out what happens when this becomes corporatized, what happens when an industry develops around sort of perception and persuasion in addition to just attunement. That's coming. But then our third example here is a safety net healthcare organization that just provides community health services. Like if you need to see a doctor but you don't have insurance and you're part of this community, this organization would offer those doctor consultations. They would offer basic medical supplies. Like there's some really good organizations that act like this. And I want to start out by thinking of this as sort of the perfect situation of attunement, which is where people who work for this organization, they understand the health needs of the particular community they're serving, which might be unique to that community. Like they might have to be sensitive to cultural preferences of that community and cultural ways of being as they interact with health. And they know how to solve these people's problems because they've attuned to what do these people generally need when they come in the health store. Very similarly to the way the hardware store people come in with a problem that they don't know an answer to, but they really need it solved. I think there's a lot of similarities over here. And the people who work at these organizations, they're really good, helpful people with great expertise and oftentimes sensitivity to the needs of those they serve. But of course, if you know anyone who works in one of these organizations, they also have to spend some time attuning to the people who fund them. And that's the government and nonprofits who are sort of figuring out where do we invest our money for the greatest value. And this can also be a healthy relationship. Now, I think it can metastasize into something that's not really focused on this community. It's focused on something else. But if we think about the ideal relationship over here, the government might recognize some sort of meta needs and sort of recognize, okay, wait, there's some problems that are leading to the underlying health problems here that could be solved in a fairly easy way that I can perhaps figure out how to solve that through this relationship I have, through this grant program. Like a good version of this relationship and this relationship would involve incentivizing the healthcare safety net people to pay attention to more meta level problems in addition to just meeting the immediate need of the population when they walk in the door. And one thing over here is that there can be kind of meta needs with one's home that a person who owns a home for the first time is not aware of. Like this could even be things like, oh, if you insulate your windows in a certain way, your energy bill will go down in the winter. And maybe a new homeowner doesn't know that. Or maybe a new homeowner doesn't know, oh, you have to check this one thing once a year and sort of keep it a little bit up to date and maybe wipe it off and check some things. And if you do that, you'll save a lot of money in the long run by not having major things go wrong that are super expensive. And an ideal situation here is that the hardware store people would be able to sort of mention that and sort of help you. Oh, have you looked at this? Have you checked it out recently? That's something that homeowners generally do. So there could be this sort of meta educational level thing going on that's actually a healthy version of this relationship. Now, of course, that can metastasize if that meta attending to certain things turns into this thing that's really just trying to make money at some level higher up. And that's something that we need to think about as we make this whole situation bigger. Now, I also need to acknowledge one of the roles of these groups could be to sort of look at other areas across the economy and see, wait a second, is there something here that's actually harming another community or harming the environment or harming something that's like an external thing? And these organizations are well placed in the system to watch for that kind of stuff. But once again, those same potentially pro-social roles of these organizations can take over and become manipulative and even harmful if it gets embedded in a system that doesn't have clear enough attunement to the actual needs of this community. So as I explore this way of thinking about and framing the economy, there are a few things that I want to watch out for. And one is the relationship between the pointing toward economy as it relates to people's efforts and their physical, visible products they produce, which is different than the attunement economy. That's sort of like, what are you producing? And maybe it's a report, or maybe it's a hammer, or maybe it's a healthcare service of a specific type. That's like what we classically think of as the economy. What's the relationship between that pointing toward economy and the pointing toward economy that is the attunement to specific problems in the world? Because those two things I think are very interconnected, but not perfectly interconnected. Okay, so where am I going with this, and what's the point of this series where we're thinking about the pointing toward economy? I mean, mainly I'm just trying to come up with different ways of visualizing the economy, because I think we may need to re-leverage how things are structured, use digital tools and artificial intelligence and blockchain to sort of figure out how is the economy interconnected and where are the leverage points to point the economy more toward the most pressing problems, as opposed to letting so much of the energy get sucked up into this mega organization with lots of internal politics and internal desires of people inside these organizations. And I think one thing that I'm concerned has happened is as the economy, as these organizations have ballooned, so much of the efforts and so much of the attunement has started to point toward this stuff itself rather than toward the actual problems that this whole machine is trying to solve. So yeah, here's really the questions I want to ask. What's the relationship between attunement to real problems and persuasion? I think that's going to be an interesting story if we can dig it up. And then what happens when the economy balloons in its interconnectedness and in the machine that serves some underlying purpose? And how can that go wrong? And then how can we sort of move the leverage points, or the points that are sort of the financier spigots, in order to better serve the problems of the economy? And then ultimately, I do think we're going to need to rethink where the financial power for organizations like this comes from, and how we make sure this financial power gets pointed toward the real problems of the world, including different communities' problems, including environmental problems, including just like what are the issues that the economy has? How do we get more of the resources focused towards those problems, as opposed to being sucked into the internal power dynamics of this growing machine?